Hey, it's David Hooper, Build a Big Podcast. The second Build a Big Podcast guest of all time is here with me, Chris Curran. On the last episode, we talked about space, meaning your podcast recording space, simple changes you can make to where you do your podcast to get a better sounding podcast. This is part 2 of the series, and we are going to focus on equipment and how to use it. I'm not an equipment guy. As a matter of fact, Chris has a great show called Podcast Engineering Show. I listed my equipment once on the web, and he had me as a guest on his podcast, and he was asking me about my equipment, and I was like, I don't know. And then he was having to guide me through it. He goes, oh, yeah, you use this, you use this, you use this. So that was a fun episode, man, because I don't know a whole lot of equipment. I have guys like you to show me what we're doing, so that's why you're here, to show us all how to use the equipment that we've got, get the best sound out of it. Where does that start?
Starts with a microphone. There's a lot of equipment, and I would almost consider software equipment sort of. I mean, I know it's different. It's software. It's not hardware, but
sure.
I think we could talk about microphones. We can talk about audio interfaces. We can talk about headphones.
Well, let's talk about a simple setup that's on a budget. I mean, probably the best thing you could invest your money in, because software, like I use Audacity, which is free.
Right.
The most expensive piece of equipment I have probably is the microphone. I'm using something called the BP40, which is by Audio-Technica, and it is a broadcast mic, very similar to RE20, very similar to the PR40 by Heil, very similar to the SM7B by Shure. Is it necessary for somebody to spend that kind of money? Because we're talking, what, $400 for that mic maybe?
I think the RE20 is about $450, and the answer is no, you don't have to spend this much on a mic. I actually have several clients. Well, let me step back. So when you're talking about microphones, you have two different types, essentially. One is a USB microphone, which you can actually just plug it directly into your computer. Now, the most popular one of those is the Audio-Technica ATR 2100.
Right, which is a great mic.
It's a very good mic for the money. I think it's, what, $65 maybe?
Yep,
and
yep.
It's USB, can go right into your computer. So if it's just a solo podcaster who's not interviewing guests in person, right? You can interview guests online, no problem. But if it's just one person in the room, you can get the ATR 2100, plug it right in USB. For $65, and if you use the right mic technique, which we sort of talked about in the last episode of this, if you use the right mic technique, you can sound really good. In fact, I have a client, a big client, who's sort of a semi-famous public person, and she's been doing her podcast for more than 3 years now, and she's only ever used the ATR 2100. But the thing is, in the beginning, I taught her proper microphone technique, and she actually listened to me, and she actually has really good mic technique, and it sounds great.
Let me tell you about the ATR 2100. When I started Red Podcast, which is my marketing podcast for experts, and also even this podcast, Build a Big Podcast, I really wanted to own podcasting, and I was proud that it was a podcast, not a radio show. The mic that you're on, the RE20, is what I normally use when I'm on broadcast radio. I said, I'm going to try this with the cheapest equipment that I can find, really own it, and hopefully be inspiring to somebody who wants to set a podcast up for $100 or less. It sounded great.
Right.
It sounded amazing. And then I was like, well, my ego got the best of me. I'm going to get one of these broadcast mics for my home studio. I don't think it was worth 5-6 times the price, as far as I don't sound 5 to 6 times better. I might sound 10% better. So if you're expecting to change your sound a lot by going to one of these broadcast mics, I'm not sure you're going to do that. You may differ though, Chris. You're an engineer and you hear things differently than the average person does.
I kind of agree with you, because you're right. Just spending more money doesn't necessarily mean you'll sound better. However, the truth about microphones is that every microphone has a different frequency pickup. It picks up different frequencies differently. It has a different frequency curve. So when choosing a mic that sounds best on your voice, it's a match between the voice and the microphone. Like some people would say, oh, the RE20 is the best mic. You should just get that one. That's the best. Well, no, that's not correct, because my voice might sound good on an RE20, but your voice might sound okay on an RE20. Maybe it sounds way better on an SM7B.
Right.
When you're choosing a mic, if you can, try out like 4 or 5 microphones if you can. And I did this. I went to the local music store with a little digital recorder, and I said, look, I want to try 4 or 5 mics. And I went in the corner, and I literally plugged each mic one by one into the recorder, and I was like, hey, this is Chris, test 1, 2, and all this testing. And then I actually brought earbuds, and I listened back right there. And then I knew which one of the 5 microphones sounded the best on my voice, and so that's the one I bought.
I got to stop you there, though, because that's your ears. So how do you know, like me, if I go in there, and we talked about this in the last episode, we were both in the music business for a long time. You on the engineering side, me on the marketing side. So I've been around mics, studios, know how to run boards, all this. I don't know that I would hear that much of a difference. So is there something specific that you're listening for, or is it just what you like?
Well, yeah. So for me, it's what I like, and also with, again, the frequency response. So some mics will have more low frequency. It'll have more body, some more bigness, if you will. Some will have less low frequencies, and they'll sound a little thin and wimpy. It comes down to your taste. However, again, when you listen to 5 in a row, so for someone who's not an engineer, instead of listening back to those 5 microphones in the store like I did, you should probably take it home and listen at home. Take your time listening at home, and then listen in your car to those 5 mics, and then listen on your boombox, if anybody has a boombox. You'll sort of gravitate toward one of them. You'll be like, oh, this one just sounds better. You don't need to explain it. You just need to know that, hey, this one probably sounds the best. I like this one.
I'm glad you mentioned listening in your car. I know you've worked with a lot of rap acts. I have as well. And one of the things that they used to do, I'm sure they still do, is they would mix down and take the work tape out into their car to see how it would sound in their car, because people were playing music in their cars.
When you're listening and deciding on the quality of something, you should listen through the medium that you normally listen to. That's why the rappers take the cassette in their car, because they're listening to rap music in their car for 8 hours a day. When they bring their own song in the car, now they get a feel for how their own song compares to the other rap music that they listen to for 8 hours. Whatever speakers or earbuds you listen to the most, that you're most familiar with, that's the best place to listen back to, in this case, these 5 microphones, and decide which one you like best.
I'm going to put you on the spot right here. I'm going to take my portable Zoom recorder, and I'm going to go to Guitar Center. And I'm going to say, hey, can I check out some of these mics that you have? Because Guitar Center, any of the big box music stores are going to have these mics available to you. Can I plug in? Can I do a test? I'm going to bring that tape back to you, Chris.
Yes.
And I want to go through these.
Yes.
And I want to have you explain to me what you are hearing, and we're going to explain what to listen for when doing one of these tests. You can do them on your own.
Oh, that'd be so cool, man. Oh, God, I love this.
All right, so let's talk about budgets. So you mentioned ATR 2100. That's a great place for you to start. Under $100. Let's say that you want to invest $1,000 into your podcast, and you want something that has a great sound. How would you spend that money?
Let's just step back 1 second to remember I talked about microphones, said there's essentially 2 types, USB, and the other type is XLR, which is the standard classic where you plug in a microphone cable to the microphone, right? It's just a 3-pin connector. It's called an XLR cable. Those are typically professional microphones. What's funny is, though, the ATR 2100 that we've been talking about, it is USB, but it's also XLR at the same time. So it's a very versatile mic.
Now, have you compared the two of those, the USB connection compared to the XLR, and does it sound different on that microphone?
Actually, no, I haven't.
But it's a digital signal compared to an analog signal is basically what you're working with. Am I right about that?
Well, yes. So the difference, right, the analog signal goes through the XLR cable to your mic preamp, whatever that is. But yeah, the digital signal in the microphone itself, it has a preamp, and then it converts it to digital right there in the mic itself, and then it sends the digital information to the computer. So yeah, they are different. I've never tested the difference. That's an interesting thing to test.
I've used them both, and honestly, I can't tell, but I don't have the ears you do.
Well, I would assume they're really close. I mean, the microphone element itself, you know, the diaphragm and the electronics in the mic, that's what makes the mic sound a certain way. So whether they convert it to digital or you run it through an XLR cable and then convert it to digital, it's going to be very similar for sure.
Okay, so it's not something to get caught up on when you have your old school engineer buddies like, oh man, you really need to record the tape and put it on 70-gram virgin vinyl. And no.
Not at all. It's just very versatile. So like if you're going to go somewhere and you're going to bring your mic and they're like, oh, you can't plug in USB, you got to plug in XLR. You can be like, okay, fine. So it's just versatility.
Well, that's one of the things I like about it is as you grow, if you start with that mic, ATR 2100, and you say, I want to get a mixer, or I want to get an interface, or I want to get compressor,
Right.
that mic can grow with you. You don't have to completely ditch it and start over again.
That's right. USB mics are one thing, then there's XLR mics, but when you have an XLR microphone, you need to plug it into a preamp. And so normally what you would get is an audio interface. And an audio interface is simply where you plug your mic into. It's a physical unit. It's a physical piece of hardware. You plug your mic into let's use the Focusrite 2i2 as the example. And then the Focusrite 2i2 is connected to your computer via USB. But the Focusrite 2i2, you can plug in two microphones. So now if you have two people in one room, you can plug in two microphones and run it into your computer and record each track separately, which is great.
Right.
So,
right.
By the way, $1,000 is a lot of money to spend. So you can get a nice Focusrite interface. You can get one or two good microphones, like maybe an SM7B, if you wanted to upgrade your mic. You could even, Sound Devices makes the MixPre 3 and the MixPre 6. I mean, the MixPre 3 is $600, and it's a phenomenal audio interface, which is also a recorder, and you can also plug in 3 microphones. So it's for $600, it's great. What you want to do when you're thinking about equipment and spending money is just be deliberate about it. Don't get all excited and go run out and buy something. Just do your research, talk to people, be deliberate, don't rush, and then by the time you come to a conclusion of what you want to buy, you'll feel confident, you'll know the pricing, and then you can just buy it and be happy.
Final question for you about the way that you use your equipment. I know with Podcast Engineering School, what you do is you suggest people take, I'm going to call it a dry signal, a dry tape, dry voice without any
raw
effects. Raw recording. You fix it in the mix. You do all that via software. What I do is I go into, it's called the DBX 286S, which is the preamp that you mentioned. It's a compressor, which makes me sound a little more radio-ish. There's what they call a noise gate, so you can't hear me breathing. I don't sound like I've got emphysema. It's like a gate. It cuts that off. And then I go into my recording. Now, for the audiobook, which is how you and I started talking, you said, no, don't use that. You don't want to get that on tape. You can't fix it if there's a problem with it. Get the raw recording. We'll fix it later. Do you recommend that for all podcasters? Is there a reason why you'd want to do what I do and go into the DBX or other effects processor as you're recording? Is there a benefit to that?
Right. So it all comes down to if you're going to have time to do some post-production later. Do you have time for that? If you do have time to sit down later and make sure and tweak the settings and maybe use some EQ or some compression, then I recommend recording it pretty much raw and just capturing the audio as best you can raw. Because then in post-production, you can optimize it. However, let's take live streaming, for instance. If you're going to, like David, if you were going to live stream, let's say a Facebook Live or YouTube Live, then it really makes sense to do what you're doing with your compressor and the gate and all that, because it's immediately going out live to the internet and you're not going to do any post-production.
Right.
So that's it. You just plan how you're going to do your production. And I mean, for instance, I should mention that my RE20 that I'm speaking into, I have it plugged into my own channel strip, which, by the way, that's what your 286 is. It's a channel strip. It has a mic preamp and some processing. I'm also plugged into a channel strip. It just happens to be a really pro channel strip, very expensive. It's just one unit. It's the Neve Portico 2, and it's a 2-rack space unit. It has a mic preamp. Same thing, almost the same thing that your DBX 286 has. Mic preamp, EQ, compressor. I'm only using a little bit of compression when I record because a little bit of compression helps just tighten up the dynamics and make it sound a little punchier. But I don't overdo it. In post-production, I do all my further processing.
You got something called Podcast Engineering School, and I love it because as you get deeper and deeper into podcasting, you start to realize what could be. And I know I listen to my old podcasts, and I got into podcasting after years and years of doing broadcast radio, years and years of being in the music industry, and I know what good sounds like, but I started to hear myself in a different way as I was editing myself. If you want to get better, Podcast Engineering School, I think, is a great option. You hear how Chris is super laid back, great at explaining stuff. if you're confused about audio and you want to make your audio sound better, I would highly recommend working with him. Talk more about Podcast Engineering School and what you do for podcasters.
I started the school because I wanted to teach people who are in podcasting, whether they're a podcaster or even if they want to be a podcast editor and have clients and make really good money editing and producing podcasts for others. I wanted to create a course that takes them from ground zero, knowing nothing about audio, then teach them the fundamentals of what is sound, what is frequency, what is wavelength, what is analog versus digital, and then all about microphones, all about mixers, signal flow, and about software, and just all the way through all the professional steps of podcast production. And it's great. I've been doing it for 2.5 years. Everybody loves it. I think I've had about 70 students so far. The school's not cheap, but it's serious. It's also more of a mentorship. It's not like there's 7 classes and then you go through the 7 classes and I say, okay, have a nice life, goodbye. It's a mentorship. You're an alumni of the school for life. We have a Slack group. If you ever need any help, you're in the group. You learn from me. I mean, I've produced podcasts. Well, first of all, I produce a lot of music in the music business, but then podcasts, for Forbes, Dun & Bradstreet, Johnson & Johnson, and all kinds of other people. So I've kind of been there and done that, and I'm really happy transferring all this knowledge to people and giving it to the students in a way where they get it. And it's very useful and practical and applicable. It's just great, man. Everybody loves the school. I love it too.
It has been cool to meet people as I've been to podcasting events that have been through the school, and I didn't know. I was like, oh, wow, you're really going deep. And it's cool to see so many editors coming out because I think that helps content creators, which is what I would consider myself to be, not an engineer. That helps guys like me get more stuff out. Everybody's got their place, and there are a lot of editors out there, and fortunately good editors, thanks to people like you, Chris. So it's podcastengineeringschool.com if you're interested in that. Chris is running this thing. There are semesters, but he has just like a real college. Can I say that? Is that insulting? Just like a real college. Forget college. This is a real college. And you say it's not cheap, but it's cheaper than college. But there are semesters, and you do them several times a year.
Yeah, 4 times a year. I call them semesters, but really one semester is the entire program. So it's a 7 or 8 week program. Yep.
Yeah, we're not talking about 4 years. We're not talking about $100,000 in debt, and you've got to pay these loans till you're 70 years old. This is a cheap education, and there's more than enough work. If you're interested in making money as a podcaster or in the podcasting industry, this is where it's at, because guys like me, I mean, we need editors big time. If you've ever heard my raw tape, you know how much I need an editor. So podcastengineeringschool.com. And you've also got the Podcast Engineering Show, which is a podcast about podcast engineering. And I've loved that because you interview people. I mentioned here talking to you that I've been on the air, and you can hear podcasters that you know talk about their setup, and it gives you a different perspective on different podcasters that you know, and they talk about how they record, how they get the sound they do. And there's a million ways to do it, just like there are a million podcasters out there. So that's a very interesting show. Podcast Engineering Show is the name of it.
Thank you, David, for having me on. I really love what you're doing. I'm happy that we've been friends for several years now, and I just really appreciate the podcast industry in general. In my opinion, there's so much opportunity still there. Like there's articles come out recently, has podcasting peaked? And it's like, what is wrong with you people? That's like saying in 1950, has the stock market peaked? It's like, come on, there is more opportunity in podcasting than any of us can imagine, and I'm happy to be part of that growth and happy to be good friends with you, David Hooper.
Thank you, sir, and I'm going to call you back when I get those tapes of me saying test 1, 2, 3 on different mics at Guitar Center. So look for that. If you want to make sure that you don't miss it, go to bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Got 3 ways for you to subscribe. Android, got you covered. iPhone, got you covered. RSS, if you're an old school hardcore podcaster. Not many people know what that is, Chris, but podcasters do. RSS, I've got you. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. You will never miss an episode. Thank you for being here, Chris. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.